Did you know that Atlético de Madrid was willing to negotiate the departure of Julián Álvarez before the World Cup? That there were conversations between Atlético and Barça that were going well? And did you know that everything was blocked because of a single person who threatened Atlético himself with leaving the club if he sold Julián? FIFA knows it, and in the next few hours it will act. Laporta called Infantino. FIFA investigated. And what it found is going to change the history of Spanish football forever. Like it if you think Julián Álvarez is going to be a Barça player before the market closes, and subscribe so you don't miss anything from this Kilburn. Because what this channel tells you today in exclusiva is the piece that was missing in this Kilburn. The one that explains why for weeks Atlético de Madrid has maintained a position of total blockade that from the outside seemed irrational. The one that explains why Gil Marín has said no again and again when the numbers told him that he should have said yes weeks ago. The one that explains everything that has happened in Cerro del Espino since Julián Álvarez returned from the World Cup with a very clear desire and an obstacle that no one had correctly identified until now. The real obstacle was not Atlético de Madrid as an institution. The real obstacle was Simeone and only Simeone. To understand what FIFA discovered when it investigated the case of Julián Álvarez, you have to understand what happened before the World Cup. Because before the World Cup, the situation between Julián, Atlético and Barça was very different from what has been experienced in recent weeks. According to the sources that this channel knows in exclusiva, there were contacts between Atlético de Madrid and FC Barcelona during the months prior to the tournament. Discreet contacts, without communications, without leaks to the press, but real contacts in which both parties explored the possibility of a transfer that both clubs considered feasible if the conditions were given. Atlético de Madrid, in those months prior to the World Cup, was not the club that afterwards the whole world would see refusing to negotiate in an unbearable way. It was a club that had on the table the possibility of entering an important amount of money for a player who, in his first year at the institution, had performed at a very high level, but who still had years of contract ahead that gave the club a strong and comfortable negotiating position. Gil Marín listened, the contacts advanced, and then the World Cup arrived. And then Julián Álvarez did something that, in the context of those discreet conversations that were advancing, was like pouring cold water over everything that had been built. In the middle of the most important tournament on the planet, in the middle of the competition in which the title was played with Argentina, Julián spoke. He publicly said that he wanted to leave Atlético de Madrid, that his dream was Barça, that he had made that decision and that he was willing to make it come true. For the football world, that statement was one more news from the market. For Simeone, it was something completely different. It was a direct and personal betrayal. Because Simeone has a very clear code on how things should be done within football. Problems are solved internally. What happens in the locker room stays in the locker room. And when a player has a desire or ambition that goes beyond what his club can offer him, he talks to his coach and his club and looks for a solution that does not harm the team or the project while the player is still committed to his work. Julián did not do that. Julián spoke in public, in the middle of the World Cup, in front of millions of people, and put Atlético in an uncomfortable position that forced the club to respond in a way that did not favor the discretion that conversations with Barça required. Simeone found out about Julián's statements like the rest of the world, watching them on television. And according to the sources this channel knows, what happened from that exact moment in the relationship between the coach and the club is what FIFA found when it investigated the case with all the available documents. Simeone called Atlético's managers that same night and told them something that the club's managers never expected to hear from their coach in those circumstances. That if Atlético de Madrid sold Julián Álvarez to FC Barcelona, he would leave the club. That he was not willing for a player who had made those public statements in the middle of the World Cup to leave Atlético in the comfortable way in which Julián wanted to leave, without consequences. That this would set a very dangerous precedent in the dressing room that Simeone could not accept under any concept as a club coach and as a person. That threat changed absolutely everything. Because Gil Marín can manage many crises, he can manage players who want to leave, he can manage offers from other clubs, he can manage the pressure of the press. What he cannot manage without devastating consequences for the project is losing Simeone, because Simeone is not only the coach of Atlético, he is the reason why Atlético de Madrid is what it is today in European football. And losing Simeone for selling Julián is an exchange that no common-sense manager would do. That's why Atlético stopped negotiating. That's why Gil Marín started saying no. That's why the club's position became unmovable overnight, when days before there were signs that the conversations were moving forward. FIFA investigated all that, and what it found is told by this channel now in the next part. But before getting to what FIFA found, there is something else that happened while all this was happening inside Atlético de Madrid that deserves to be told. Because while Simeone pressured the club's managers not to sell Julián, and while Gil Marín yielded to that pressure and turned the conversations with Barça into a total blockade, something happened on the other side that was going to completely change the balance of forces in this situation. At Barça, they began to despair. Hansi Flick had been waiting for months for a top-level striker to complete his system. Not just any striker, a 9 of absolute guarantees for the most important games. A player who could solve the most difficult games from the most demanding position on the pitch. And Julián Álvarez was exactly the profile that Flick needed to complete a team that in recent weeks had made it clear that he lacked precisely that. A top-level striker who would turn the chances that Flick's system generated into real goals in decisive moments. Deco worked, Laporta observed, and at some point in recent weeks Laporta made a decision that accelerated everything that was to come. He decided that Barça would not wait any longer, that if Atlético did not move voluntarily, it was necessary to find a way for it to move with external help. And that external help had a very specific name, Gianni Infantino directly, the president of FIFA in person. Laporta called Infantino directly, and according to the sources that this channel knows, that call was direct and without surroundings on what Barça urgently needed and on what FIFA could do to facilitate that the case of Julián Álvarez reached a resolution that respected the will of the player, in the way that the FIFA regulations clearly established that it must be respected. That call from Laporta to Infantino is the one that, according to the sources that this channel knows, accelerated the times within FIFA in a way that no one within Atlético calculated. Because suddenly the case of Julián Álvarez ceased to be one more file on the table of the FIFA jurists, and it became a matter that the president of the organization himself continued with direct and personal attention. And when Infantino continues a case with direct and personal attention, the times change in a way that no one can ignore. Neither Atlético de Madrid nor any other club in the world. When FIFA investigates a case like that of Julián Álvarez, it does not do it in the same way that it investigates a doping or an accounting irregularity. It does it by reviewing internal conversations of the club, official documents, messages between managers, calls that were recorded in some format. All the trace left by an institutional decision, when that decision has direct consequences on the career of a player who has publicly expressed his desire to change club. And what the FIFA investigators found when they began to review that trace, in the case of Atlético de Madrid and Julián Álvarez, is something that no one within the club Rojiblanco expected to find at any time. Because what they found did not point to Atlético de Madrid as an institution in any objective sense. It pointed to a very specific and identifiable person. To a person whose influence within the club is so absolute that his personal decisions automatically become institutional decisions without anyone within the club being able or willing to contradict them under any circumstance. FIFA found Simeone's threats not as rumors, not as versions of one of the parts of the conflict, but as documentation, as conversations that were recorded in which the coach of Atlético made it very clear to the managers that if they sold Julián, he would abandon the project. That he was not willing for the public statements of a player during the World Cup to have the consequence that that player left Atlético the way Julián wanted to leave. That is exactly what FIFA has in its power right now as a result of its investigation, and that is what completely changes the nature of the sanction that the organization will apply in the next few hours to the entire world of football. Because if FIFA had found that Atlético de Madrid, as an institution, had decided not to negotiate, the sanction would have been for the club. An economic fine, a ban on signings, the type of sanctions that FIFA usually applies when it determines that a club has acted contrary to the will of a player. But what FIFA found when it investigated in depth is different from what it expected to find. What it found is that Atlético de Madrid, as an institution, was genuinely willing to negotiate before everything changed. That Gil Marín had conversations with Barça that were progressing discreetly. That Julián's transfer was something that the club considered perfectly possible and reasonable if the right economic conditions were given for both parties. And that all that stopped when Simeone called and threatened to leave if the club sold its player. That the decision to block the negotiations was not from Atlético de Madrid as an institution. It was from Simeone, acting from his position of absolute power within the club to prevent a player who had publicly disrespected him during the World Cup from leaving comfortably and happily. That distinction is essential to understand the sanction that FIFA will apply in the next few hours to the entire world of football. Because if FIFA had found that Atlético de Madrid, as an institution, had decided not to negotiate, the sanction would have been for the club. An economic fine, a ban on signings, the type of sanctions that FIFA usually applies when it determines that a club has acted contrary to the will of a player. But what FIFA found when it investigated in depth is different from what it expected to find. What it found is that Atlético de Madrid, as an institution, was genuinely willing to negotiate before everything changed. That Gil Marín had conversations with Barça that were progressing discreetly. That Julián's transfer was something that the club considered perfectly possible and reasonable if the right economic conditions were given for both parties. And that all that stopped when Simeone called and threatened to leave if the club sold its player. That the decision to block the negotiations was not from Atlético de Madrid as an institution. It was from Simeone, acting from his position of absolute power within the club to prevent a player who had publicly disrespected him during the World Cup from leaving comfortably and happily. That distinction is essential to understand the sanction that FIFA will apply in the next few hours. Because FIFA will not sanction Atlético de Madrid. It will sanction Simeone. It will apply the sanction directly to the coach, who, according to the investigation of the organization, is responsible for the players being systematically ignored for weeks. And the sanction that FIFA will apply to Simeone is the one that no World Cup coach expected to have applied to a coach of his level and his career. For Champions League games without exception. Without being able to sit on the bench of Atlético. Without being able to lead the club in the most important European football competition during that period. For consecutive games in which Atlético de Madrid will have to compete in the Champions League without its historic coach. Because that coach used his position of power to block the exit of a player who legitimately wanted to go to another club of his choice. In addition to that sports sanction, FIFA will apply an economic sanction to Simeone, whose amount, according to the sources that this channel knows, is significant and proportional to the damage that FIFA has determined that its interference caused in the career and in the will of the affected player. But there is something else in this sanction that goes beyond the 4 games and the economic fine. Something that FIFA is going to do this time that it had never done in the history of the organization. Something that, according to the sources that this channel knows, represents a change of method that FIFA has decided to adopt precisely because the case of Julián Álvarez has turned out to be the perfect example to communicate to the whole world of football what are the rules that from now on will be applied in a public and transparent way. FIFA is going to publish the sanction in its official media, not in an internal statement that is sent to the club and that the club can manage discreetly. In its official channels, on their website, on their social networks, so that the whole world of football sees it, so that all the coaches and directors and players on the planet know that this happened and that this had these consequences. That is what changes the history of football with this case. That FIFA has decided that transparency is the best tool, so that situations like that of Julián Álvarez do not repeat themselves. That when a player publicly expresses his will to leave and someone inside his club blocks him using his position of power, that person is going to respond publicly to the world of football and not just to the FIFA jurists in a Zurich office. There is something about the FIFA's decision to publish this sanction in its official media that deserves to be analyzed. Because that decision is not just a matter of transparency. It is a very clear political message that FIFA sends to all the players of world football at a time when the credibility of the organization has been under pressure from multiple fronts for years. FIFA needs to show the world that its regulations have real teeth and real consequences. That when a player goes to the organization to protect his rights, the organization acts effectively and completely visible to everyone. That it is not enough to send a discreet letter to a club or impose an economic fine that the club pays in silence and that no one outside the process comes to know. That the protection of the rights of the players has to be visible and public so that it is truly real and dissuasive. The case of Julián Álvarez gives FIFA exactly that opportunity. A clear case with documentation, with a player known worldwide, with a first-level coach as the protagonist of the interference, with a club as visible as Atlético de Madrid, and with a club of such a powerful destination in the media as FC Barcelona. There could not be a first case more perfect or more visible for the new method that FIFA wants to implement before the whole world of football. Julián Álvarez is the first. His case opens a new path in the way that FIFA manages the conflicts between players and people with power over their careers. And that path begins with a public sanction of one of the most important coaches in European football in the last 15 years. And Simeone will be the first to experience it throughout the history of football. The first coach in the history of this sport whose sanction for deliberately interfering in the will of a player will be officially published in the media of FIFA, so that the whole world of football sees it and understands perfectly what it means. That is what happens in the next few hours, and that is the context in which the signing of Julián Álvarez by FC Barcelona will close before this market ends. What that sanction means for the future of Julián Álvarez at Barça and for Atlético de Madrid is what we tell in the last part of this story. The FIFA sanction with Simeone changes absolutely the entire table of negotiations between Atlético de Madrid and FC Barcelona. Not because Atlético is going to sell Julián for fear of FIFA or for any type of direct institutional coercion, but because the sanction eliminates the only real obstacle that had prevented those negotiations from advancing for weeks and weeks of total blockade. Simeone can no longer threaten to leave. He can no longer use his position of power within the club to prevent Gilmarin from sitting with Deco to talk about numbers. Because if Simeone tries to do something similar now, after having been publicly sanctioned by FIFA, the organization has both the precedent and the documentation to apply much more serious consequences than 4 Champions League games. Simeone knows it and Gilmarin knows it, and that is why, according to the sources that this channel knows, what is happening now within Atlético de Madrid is something that 2 weeks ago seemed impossible. The club is willing to negotiate the departure of Julián Álvarez with FC Barcelona. Not because he wants to, not because he has changed his mind about whether it is convenient for him or not to sell him, but because FIFA has taken away from Simeone the tool with which he blocked those negotiations, and now Gilmarin has room to do what the numbers always told him was the most sensible thing. Sell Julián Álvarez at the right price. FIFA, in addition to sanctioning Simeone, has done something else that completely changes the nature of how these negotiations are going to develop from now on. It has appointed an official supervisor, a person designated by the organization itself, who will follow the negotiation process between Atlético de Madrid and FC Barcelona from start to finish without any possible interruption. An observer with real authority, who will make sure that the agreement reaches a good port without any kind of interference, and that Julián Álvarez will to sign for Barça materializes in a real contract before the signing market closes this summer. That supervisor does not have the power to set the price. He does not have the power to force Atlético to accept a specific offer from Barça. What he has the power to do is ensure that the negotiations develop in good faith, and that no one within the process uses his position to block them in the way that Simeone had blocked them until now. That is exactly what Julián needed. Not a specific price, not a specific offer from Barça that Atlético had to accept. A guarantee that the negotiations were going to be able to reach their natural conclusion without anyone interrupting them along the way. And that guarantee now exists with the FIFA logo on top. Deco already knows that he has the way free. According to the sources that this channel knows, the sporting director of Barça has been preparing for hours the offer that he is going to put on top of Gilmarin's table in the next few hours. An offer that, according to the sources that this channel knows, will be within the range that Atlético considers acceptable after weeks of blocking. A price that Atlético would have rejected 2 weeks ago, not because it was insufficient, but because Simeone would have called Gilmarin to tell him that if he accepted that offer, he would leave Atlético. That call is not going to happen, or if it happens, it is not going to have the consequences that it had before FIFA made it known what it found in its investigation. For Julián Álvarez, this is the moment that he has been waiting for months with all his patience and all his determination. He has gone to FIFA when no one expected him to go that far. He has waited without giving up. He has endured training with Barca's equipment placed in front of the cameras of the world. He has endured that Simeone prevented him from entering the facilities with the police as a witness. He has lived weeks of a snake that has put his mental resistance to the test in a way that few players in the world would have endured without giving up before. And now the road is clear. When Deco calls Selmarin and Gilmarin picks up the phone with the FIFA supervisor following the process closely, the conversation is going to be completely different from all the previous conversations that the two clubs have had on this matter for weeks. It is going to be a conversation in which Atlético Madrid knows that the price offered to Barça is going to be reviewed by someone who works for FIFA and has real authority. and a conversation in which Barca knows that there is no longer any Simeone waiting on the other side of the phone to torpedo the agreement at the last moment as it has done so far. Those conditions did not exist a week ago. They exist now. And those conditions are exactly what the two clubs and Julián himself need for this signing to be definitively closed. For the fans who have followed this snake from the beginning, there is something that deserves to be said before closing this story definitively. What Julián Álvarez has done in recent weeks to achieve his dream of signing for Barca is something that goes beyond what any player had ever done in a similar situation. He has gone to FIFA, he has endured public humiliation, he has maintained his goal at a time when everyone around him was telling him that it was impossible. And he has achieved it. Not only the signing that he has pursued so much, he has achieved something much bigger and more lasting. He has achieved that FIFA change its way of protecting players from all over the world. That from now on, the sanctions for interfering in the will of a player are public and completely visible to the whole world of football, without exception. That the case of Julián Álvarez is recorded in the history books of football, not only as the most memorable snake of the summer, but as the case that changed the rules of the game forever and for good. There is something about what is happening now in Atlético de Madrid that deserves to be told before closing this story definitively. Because the sanctions against Simeone not only directly affect Julián's signing, it affects the coach's relationship with the club in a way that will have consequences beyond this market. Because Simeone has been publicly sanctioned by FIFA, the first coach in the history of football to receive that type of public sanction. And that leaves a mark on his figure and on his relationship with Atlético that no statement of support from the club can erase. Gil Marín will now have to manage a completely new situation. On the one hand, he has to negotiate Julián's departure with Barca, with a FIFA supervisor, following the process closely. On the other hand, he has to manage a sanctioned Simeone who knows that the club has given in to the pressure of FIFA and Julián in a matter that he considered personal. And he has to do it while Atlético prepares its season with the Champions League on the horizon. It is not an easy situation for anyone within Atlético de Madrid at this delicate moment of the preseason. But it is exactly the situation that Simeone himself has created with his documented threats that FIFA found when he investigated the case with all the means at his disposal. Football has consequences, and this time they came before the market closed. Julián Álvarez will be a FC Barcelona player. Simeone will be publicly sanctioned by FIFA, and Spanish football will remember this summer as the most explosive in its recent history. Subscribe and like, because when Julián signs for Barca, this channel tells you before anyone else in the world of football. This story is already history.